one of the reasons that Trump attacked Iran and the way he did was they were worried in the White House that Netanyahu was actually going to use a nuke against the Iranian, against Fordow, or one of the so-called nuclear enrichment sites. And he did it to forestall that. I heard that from a credible source. So I have to give some weight to it. So what would Trump do? I think he might sort of say, well, send the B-2s again to do a bombing and to do a sort of, and then to declare victory and call a halt.
Hi, I'm John Kiriakou, and welcome back to Deep Focus. If you look at the news on any given day, it almost seems that the world is falling apart. The United Nations and other international organizations have confirmed, for example, that Gaza is in a state of famine, the likes of which the world hasn't seen in the last 40 years. Israel and Iran remain on the brink of yet another hot war that could become regional or, God forbid, even global. There's no end in sight in the war between Russia and Ukraine, despite Donald Trump's protestations, and the U.S. has thrown the international economy into a tizzy by imposing draconian tariffs on some countries and sanctions on others. With the current players in place, is it even possible for the world to negotiate its way out of this? We're happy to be joined by one of the most respected voices in contemporary foreign and defense policy. That's Andrew Cockburn. Andrew is a journalist and the Washington, D.C. editor of Harper's magazine. His books and articles are principally about national security, and he has produced many documentary films, including award winners. He even produced a successful Hollywood movie, The Peacemaker, that starred George Clooney and Nicole Kidman. Amazing. You can find more of his work on his Substack. That's at spoilsofwar.substack.com. Andrew, thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure. Good to see you again.
Hey, it's a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much. Andrew, there's so much that I want to ask you that I barely know where to begin. So let's start with the current state of play between Israel and Palestine. The Israelis now are attacking Gaza City as if there's anything left to attack. It's been essentially razed. The Israelis tell us that they're going in for the final kill on Hamas. Hamas is essentially already gone. It's dead. But there are more important issues at play here. Number one, famine and starvation. What can you tell us about what's happening in Gaza right now?
Well, as you mentioned, the United Nations and anyone else with looking at the situation agrees that there is widespread famine, starvation in Gaza. It's getting worse. It has been getting worse. And it's so bad that even the mainstream press here has had to acknowledge it.
Finally.
Even we're told Trump himself was sort of slightly taken aback by the images of starving children, which to stir that flinty heart is saying something, if indeed it happened. So, the situation, as you say, is ghastly beyond belief. And what is as ghastly, as horrible, what goes with it, is the general indifference. That the whole climate of the international establishment is to look away, is to sort of say, well, we blame Hamas. In the United Kingdom, in Britain, they're arresting people for holding up signs saying we support Palestine. Elderly people are being dragged off the street just for that. In Germany, it's hardly better. In fact, it's as bad. And I find that, as bad as the misery and suffering that's being inflicted on the poor people of Gaza and indeed of Palestinians on the way, in that region generally, is the indifference. I mean, it's totally chilling. It feels like, all sense of moral obligation has disappeared. It's, remember the statement that by a French moralist in the 17th century that hypocrisy is the tribute vice pays to virtue. Well, they're not even being hypocritical about it. I mean, they just sort of cheer it on, which I find, really brings me to despair.
The end game here for the Israelis can't be to quote unquote destroy Hamas. It's already been destroyed. There's nothing left. Is the Israeli goal ethnic cleansing? Is it to expel all Palestinians from Gaza, or even more broadly from Gaza and the West Bank?
Well, they keep saying so. So I think we should take them at their word. These characters in the Israeli government, particularly as Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but actually also the entire establishment there. And in fact, according to the polls, a large chunk of the Israeli population, stand four square behind this policy. And it's been, we should say, that's it's been the policy long before Netanyahu was ever heard of. I mean, going back really to, the Nakba, to the mass expulsions of 1948, the expulsions of 1967, which don't get so much talked about, but they certainly happened. I mean, I was told by a former New York Times reporter that they actually speeded up refugees fleeing the West Bank with napalm, and at the end of the June War. So this is nothing new. It's just they're more unabashed about it. Unfortunately, sadly, they seems to be meeting with every sign of success. I think it's generally acknowledged now from most quarters that there's a genocide ongoing. You can also call it policy of extermination. Every day, it's become horribly routine. 20, 40, 60, 100 Palestinians killed in the last 24 hours. I mean, that used to be, when a massacre like that occurred anywhere in the world, that would be sort of named. We'd remember that as the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Beirut in 1982, when they massacred several hundred Palestinians in a refugee camp. Now it's routine, and in itself that's just so horrible. And as I say, what goes with it is the indifference of the subject, not the people around the world. I mean, it's
Right.
more and more we have polls showing that a growing majority of Americans and certainly of Democrats regard this for what it is and decry it. The same in Europe, the same in Britain, the same certainly in the country of my upbringing in Ireland, where it's one of the governments where the government, for once, at least one government is standing, telling it like it is, along with much of the global South. But certainly the power structure is generally internationally remains unaffected.
Can you offer up any insights as to why these horrible things that we have seen reported in the international media, the starvation, the dying of thirst, the flattening of every hospital, why these images, why these news stories have not affected US policy toward Israel and Palestine, regardless of who happens to be in the White House, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican? Why does the United States attach itself so closely to Israel, despite the fact that there are obviously crimes against humanity taking place?
It's in a way, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think there's one you can point to various factors. One of which is money. I was once told by, actually, I can say who it was. He's long dead. Stephen Smith, who was President Kennedy's brother-in-law and a very important figure in Democratic Party organization and particularly in the Kennedy family. He said, "Oh, the state of Israel was bought with $2 million that went in a paper bag on the Harry Truman campaign train in 1948." So you could go back to that. And you have ongoing from that, the increasing flows of Israeli interest money into politics here, particularly into the Democrats, who basically are fundamentally dependent on this. But certainly also, with Donald Trump, the enormous sums from the casino boss in Las Vegas, $100 million here, $100 million there. So that's a very important part. And backed up by a very, very carefully and almost amazingly proficient campaign of propaganda, of seizing on the critical points of how information is controlled and disseminated in this country. For example, we just see just now basically CBS, the Tiffany network has passed in the hands of Larry Ellison, the owner of Oracle, second richest man in America, who is an avowed Zionist, strong proponent of anything and everything that Israel does, and so that's what was once, in a very tiny way, was kind of might have been sometimes an unbiased source, though not much, is now going to be under that full control, and that goes across the board. So that's another important thing. The very assiduous deployment of the Holocaust, which is seized on the American imagination. I mean, it's interesting that nothing. Obviously, it's a great thing to have the Holocaust Museum in Washington D.C., but actually that preceded the African American Museum, the American Indian Museum. I mean, we recognize this and gave it pride of place in the heart of Washington ahead of things more relevant to our own history. I don't want to minimize the Holocaust Museum, but I think it's interesting that came first. So in so many ways, there's a vice-like grip on American culture, which is waning now, I have to say, certainly broad masses, and we can look to the striking success of Zoran Mamdani in New York, and it's very striking that he, according to the polls, enjoys a 17% lead among New York Jewish voters.
Right.
So something significant is happening, but it's got a long way to go.
Andrew, switching to Iran, the Iranian government has practiced something that they're calling strategic patience for quite some time now. They either didn't respond to Israeli military attacks or they responded with great restraint. You remember the drones, the Israelis fired missiles at Iran. Iran sent drones and then called in advance and said, we're sending the drones. They'll be there in 6 hours. Well, now the U.S. has jumped in, apparently as a favor to Netanyahu, to bomb Iranian nuclear sites. And there's still talk that the Israelis are going to go back and hit Iran again. Why? I don't have the foggiest idea. Where do you think this puts us? The conventional wisdom is that the Israelis are likely to attack unprovoked. They won't even pretend to have been threatened by the Iranians. Do you see another attack coming? And what would you expect the U.S. to do this time around?
Well, it does seem likely. I mean, we have to remember that, we're dealing with a figure, Netanyahu, whose own political survival appears to depend on ongoing war.
That's
war
right.
with, war principally, of course, against the Palestinians, but, war against pretty much everyone in the neighborhood. Against Syria, against Lebanon, and against Yemen, for that matter, and against Iran. So, I think, always believe that the fundamental driver of anyone's foreign policy is domestic politics. I don't believe politicians act in have a sense in their head of foreign policy like the international relations academic community likes to pretend. People, they do it for whatever in ways that they think will enhance their own political fortunes. And that's certainly what Netanyahu is up to. So if he sees this is advantageous or necessary for him, he will do it, and the Israeli national security establishment will go along with it. What will the U.S. do? Well, Trump, his default seems to be basically give Netanyahu what he wants. So he may. I mean, there is I'll put it no better than a rumor, maybe other people with better sources could confirm it, that one of the reasons that Trump attacked Iran and the way he did was they were worried in the White House that Netanyahu was actually going to use a nuke against the Iranian, against Fordow, or one of the so-called nuclear enrichment sites, and he did it to forestall that. I heard that from a credible source, so I have to give some weight to it. So, what would Trump do? I think he might sort of say, well, send the B-2s again, to do a bombing and to do a sort of, and then to declare victory and call a halt. That would seem to be a pattern here. I don't think, Trump is, it's still important, politically important for him to be the president who ends wars. So to the extent that a lot of his base sort of believed that, and signed on partly because of that. So I don't think he certainly, I do not think would go to the lengths of, putting American troops into an assault on Iran.
No.
But it's an open question.
Well, the Trump administration says still that talks with Iran can continue despite the attacks that have taken place, despite the threat of additional attacks. Is that even worth discussing? Can you see a scenario where the U.S. and the Iranians sit across the table from one another, whether it's in Muscat or some other country, and carry on real talks?
Well, the Iranians, as you say, practice strategic patience. So that's taking patience a bit far. And remember,
Indeed.
Trump was promising talks just before he bombed Iran, and then put it out that the reason he'd said he was have the talks was to sort of get the Iranians to lower their guard so he could take them by surprise. So if I were in the Iranian government, I'd be pretty skeptical of any offer from Trump to make some kind of a deal. Remember, this is a pretty scatterbrained individual we're dealing with. So he might, he might in the middle of the night, sort of wake up and think, oh, I should make a deal and issue some directive on Truth Social, and then change his mind again the next day. So I would say the Iranians, maybe like the rest of the world, is waiting, think the best thing to do is sit tight and wait him out. That's certainly the Europeans' view. I've been told by a pretty well-informed European commentator recently that the attitude of the Europeans is sort of, gritting their teeth and waiting for the midterms. They're putting faith in the midterms. Maybe then Trump will be neutered and, we can all come out on the grass to play. But
don't count on it.
I wouldn't bet on that.
No. You said something a few minutes ago that I'd like to pursue, and I was wondering if maybe the import was just in my own mind. I think that it's not. You said how difficult things are becoming in the UK, especially when someone takes to the streets and holds up a sign saying that they support Palestine. It's even worse in some cases in Germany. I have a friend, Richard Medhurst. I'm sure that you and Richard are friends, or at least friendly acquaintances as well. I have another friend who has been arrested for advocating for Palestinian human rights in northern England. We all know the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who has been hounded repeatedly by British law enforcement because of his activism, either on behalf of the Palestinians or on behalf of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. What's happening in the UK vis-a-vis civil liberties and civil rights? Are you not permitted anymore to have a view that is out of the governmental mainstream, lest you be arrested and prosecuted?
It's getting that way. It's Britain has always been more than people realize a kind of a police state. Remember, I mean, if we think back to the years of the Northern Ireland troubles, or whatever you want to call it, I mean, they back to the days of internment, they suddenly invoked the right. They locked up hundreds of people without trial in internment, kept hundreds and hundreds of people in jail for years. So the British state has always, well, they like to sort of talk themselves up as a free country. That there's always been this there. That the security services are immensely powerful in Britain and are becoming more so. And especially when you have a very weak government like Starmer, who seems to have, it always amazes me, disgusts me that he's described as a human rights lawyer, which is kind of, he's kind of disgraced. I mean, the words Starmer and human rights should not be linked in any way. So you now have a situation where, in a sort of mad way. I mean, it's, this the other day when they had this, mass protest in London, and hundreds of, I can't remember the exact number, but over 100 people, most of them elderly, retired school teachers and nurses and so forth, held up signs saying, I support Palestine. I support Palestine action, were immediately arrested and dragged away. It's gotten so mad that one chap held up a sign saying, I support plasticine, which is the British word for Play-Doh, and they arrested him.
Oh my goodness.
So it's bad, that they, but you think back, I mean, it was pretty shocking to a lot of people. It should have been shocking to more people in Britain during the COVID time, when they suddenly, had imposed this nationwide lockup, the right to tell everyone not to leave their house, which a friend of mine, Jonathan Sumption, former Supreme Court justice and very eloquent jurist, and he spoke out about that, but he was a lonely voice. And most of the British people sort of just submitted and did it. And it seemed, I suppose, they thought it was justified. We got to stop this horrible plague, which it obviously didn't. But the fact that they all knuckled under was surprising to me, I must say. But it shouldn't have been, because that is, in a way, a British tradition of subservience to authority, which differs, I hope, from this country, but we're finding out as days go by.
I wanted to ask you about Germany as well, and I do this for a selfish reason. I try hard not to get involved in Twitter arguments with people, but sometimes I just can't help myself. And I noticed that Disney had announced an animated series on the life and times of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And so I tweeted, of all things, for Disney to focus on, you're going to try to whitewash the life of a genocidal maniac. That's what I said. Of course, Turks jumped all over me. I forgot about it by the next day. 2 weeks later, I get an email to my personal email account, and it's from the German National Police saying that they had completed their investigation of me, and they determined that I had not committed a hate crime. It was only then that I realized.
Oh, relieved to hear it. Yeah.
Right. Well, when you consider that silly story, along with the fact that Germany has been, along with the United States, the most almost irrationally pro-Israel country in the world.
Yeah.
Do you think that is because of a reaction against their own history of Nazi authoritarianism? Or do Germans really believe that Palestinians have to be destroyed or expelled or smothered? Or what exactly do you think we're looking at in terms of German foreign policy toward Israel and Palestine?
Well, it's very weird, that they, the wholesale, the sort of Germanic efficiency with which they've, clamped down on, people, anyone who wants, well, maybe you'll get away with it, but anyone who once tweeted or, support for Palestine or think, who might have been getting some arts grant in Germany or been invited to some arts festival is suddenly disallowed. Um, it's a strange sort of mania that seems to have overtaken them. I mean, and as we know, Germany has a record on manias, and so it's taking a form. Obviously, there is ever since particularly the whole business of Razon, or whatever they call it. The very sort of existence or purpose of the German state is to make up for the Holocaust and therefore be nice to Israel, which seems to become hardwired in their system. You also have like the most powerful media conglomerate in Germany, the Bild, the Springer organization, which I think, but don't they own Politico too? So it's
I wouldn't be surprised.
but there. I mean, if you look at what Bild says about about Palestine and everything, it's completely horrifying and disgusting. Certainly even by our standards. So it's that has a powerful effect. Maybe things are changing. You see, I mean, Merz did the other day say maybe he wasn't going to send any more weapons to the specific purpose of killing Palestinians, but already seeing reports that German companies are sort of getting around that. So it's a very odd case in which there's also a certain amount of xenophobia sort of that's come in because of the very large numbers of Muslims who've migrated to Germany, Turks long ago now, but also Syrians and other refugees, which has had, I suppose, predictable effects on German society. So that's all part of it, but it's it's completely bonkers the way they behave.
It is indeed. Turning to Russia and Ukraine, Donald Trump likes to bark orders and to have people do what he tells them to do. And I think in many cases, he convinces himself that that's exactly what's going to happen. But that hasn't happened with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The Ukrainians feel abandoned, and the Russians just won't be pushed. Do you think there's some sort of a peace agreement possible in the near future, given these current circumstances? And what are the Europeans saying about this new push coming from the Trump White House?
Well, the Europeans are. I mean, you saw this sad little performance at the White House the other day when they all flew over. God knows what that did to climate change, the emissions from all those government jets whizzing across the Atlantic. But it was kind of a pathetic display. I mean, there was a picture that got tweeted of them all sitting outside the Oval Office in a row. It was Macron and they all looking at their phones and so forth. And someone tweeted that saying, meanwhile waiting outside the principal's office. And that was him. And then Trump, he treated them with sort of contempt because he didn't bother to greet them at the door, sent some flunky to sort of let them in, and then and they when they came in to sort of harangue him, I think van der Leyen said, "Oh, and what about all the Ukrainian children kidnapped by Putin?" And Trump said, "Well, that's not what we're talking about." And, he pretended to sort of, he was polite, but he obviously doesn't take them that seriously. At the end of it all, we had this announcement that that the Europeans would spend $100 billion, which they don't have, to buy weapons from the US, which the US doesn't have, to send arms for the use to Ukraine to arm its soldiers, which Ukraine doesn't have. So that was that was the deal we were supposed to believe in. And so, Trump sees Europe as basically something to be milked, get them to buy American weapons. This is his main object, his main idea, which the Europeans, sort of pathetic way, are going along with. I mean, Britain the other day announced that it was going to buy a further 12 F-35As, a plane which has become a sort of byword here for, unfulfilled, can't fly half the time, can't take off in a lightning storm, all the rest of it, gun can't shoot straight, so on and so forth. But, Starmer, dutifully said, as opposed to buying a British plane, which he could have done, yes, we'll buy 12 F-35As at whatever it is, 80 million a pop, to carry nuclear, specifically for the purpose of carrying an American nuclear weapon. So they seem happy to be the handmaidens of, to do what they're told by Trump, in return for which he throws tariffs at them, according to which go up and down, but still they're there. It's not great for Europe economically. And the Russians, the Russians keep saying, well, we started this war for a specific purpose, which was to stop Ukraine joining NATO and to sort of ensure or to make Ukraine be a neutral country. I mean, I think actually the reason Putin started the war was to sort of deal with threats to him from the right, the nationalist right in Russia, because, as I said earlier, I believe that no politician ever does anything for reasons of foreign policy, but for reasons of domestic political imperatives. But anyway, that's what they say they're on about, and to the extent that that's not going to happen anytime soon, that the West, that even Trump can't sort of doesn't feel he can go to the lengths of saying, well, okay, we accept no Ukraine in NATO, or no Ukraine, Ukraine as a neutral country, and Ukraine essentially demilitarized, which is what the Russians are demanding. And they also say denazified, by which I suppose they mean they can take down all those tributes to Nazi collaborators in World War II, which have been springing up around Ukraine. So so the war will go on. But, there is, there's obviously another development in process, which is on the ground, the Ukrainians appear to be slowly losing. I mean, the Russians are advancing, albeit slowly. The Ukrainians are running out of manpower. You've got stories of whole stretches of the front being held by sort of just a few dozen Ukrainian soldiers. So the Russians obviously think that that they're going to win, which is all too possible. And I don't know enough. We don't know enough. We're not told enough about what's going on inside Ukrainian politics. We now have, polls showing that an overwhelming percentage of the Ukrainian population just want the war to stop, even at the expense of giving up territory, of abandoning, what Zelensky has long said is his goals, is to liberate territory occupied by Russia. But maybe things, there'll be a change in Ukraine itself, and they will have to settle for at least a lot of what the Russians are demanding. I don't know. What do you think?
I think you've hit it on the head. I think that that Zelensky needs a dose of realism, that he's going to have to concede territory. And in the greater scheme of things, is he really going to miss that territory? It's ethnically Russian. They speak Russian. Most of the residents there want to be Russian. Isn't it better to just get this thing behind us and start fresh, especially if it's accompanied with fast-track European Union membership? I think that's kind of a
Yes.
fair deal.
Although the membership of the European Union is looking like less and less of a good deal.
Yeah.
And I think there's a
Yes.
big problem with that, which is one of the things that's really undermining support for Ukraine in Eastern Europe, particularly in Poland and in in Romania, and other is the fact that they're largely still sort of to a large extent farm economies, and the farmer lobby in those countries really haven't liked the influx of Ukrainian agriculture, of Ukrainian grain. Remember, they dropped the tariffs.
Yes,
And
indeed.
now they're reimposing them again. So it's electorally very dangerous for a lot of those Eastern European countries to think about to push for Ukrainian membership of the EU. I'd have thought.
Andrew, I wanted to ask you a domestic question or two, if I may. Donald Trump seems to be deputizing just about everybody with any federal law enforcement capabilities these days. Here in Washington, just over the past week, we have the National Guard in the streets, completely unnecessarily, working alongside the DC police, as well as agents from the ATF, the DEA, the FBI, even the Bureau of Prisons. Isn't this a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act? Can Donald Trump legitimately, legally keep the National Guard in the streets of Washington? Or not just Washington, he's talking about Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, or anywhere else. Is this legal?
Uh, well, no, it's not. But but remember something that Trump, back in his first term, Trump remarked at one point. He said, "I have a lot of powers that people don't even know about." And what he was talking about was all the emergency power. There's, not that's on the statute books, and a lot of it in very dusty corners that no one looked at for a long time, are all these emergency powers that have been granted by Congress to the president over the years. A lot of it to do with, spurred by the Cold War and the threat of nuclear attack. There's a whole sort of set of things that can happen under the rubric of continuity of government. I'm sure you know about this. Where Trump can suspend the internet if he wants, so that he can, and he's invoking all these. He's invoking all these a lot of emergency powers. There's a piece in the Times, actually, I think today, pointing this out. But I wrote about it some time ago. That for instance, the militarization of the border, that's under an emergency power. The tariffs are under emergency power. To stop the flow, the torrent of fentanyl coming in from Canada. That's an emergency. The threat, which seems to be going ahead with, to send drones into Mexico because they've designated cartels as terrorist organizations. That's an emergency power. So it's under that. I mean, we have this. Trump has clearly remembered those things about his powers, and that's what he's deploying. I mean, the Posse Comitatus Act. We all believe, oh no, you can't have American troops deployed on the streets. Although, if you think back to 1968, we had machine guns on the steps of the Capitol. So the Posse Comitatus seems to go away in a hurry whenever they can think up some reason, spurious or otherwise, to invoke it.
Isn't that the truth?
And it's all, for a lot of, what Trump's doing, what's happening with the National Guard and in Washington and presumptively elsewhere. For Trump, to say it is to do it. It's the action, it's the orders, what he gets off on. It's the Truth Social Post. It's performative. They're claiming now that thanks to the deployment of the National Guard, there hasn't been a single murder in in Washington, D.C. all week. No one in Southeast has, done a drive-by shooting, even though there aren't any National Guard troops there. But certainly no one's been murdered in Union Station. And I walked through it yesterday, and I didn't see any corpses. So it's it's all this, he gets away with so much just on the basis of lies, lies about the economy, lies about, in this case, about a crime wave in Washington, D.C. And people point out till they're blue in the face that there is no crime wave in Washington, D.C., that, crime has been going steadily down for years. So that's just fake statistics. Fire the statistician. I think it was Truth Social today or the last day or so about Muriel Bowser better stop putting out fake figures on crime. So it's it's the big lie that Joseph Goebbels talked about years ago, and it seems to work. A lot of the media, as we mentioned earlier, is being intimidated or certainly brought on board. I mean, the immediate collapse of Disney with the ABC case, this ridiculous suit that Trump brought, which they immediately caved and paid a bribe. CBS now. The one interesting thing I'd like to mention, I take a great interest in, is I think a big mistake on his part is suing Rupert Murdoch for the Wall Street Journal story about his obscene doodle in the birthday card to Jeffrey Epstein all those years ago. And I don't think Murdoch will cave. And if Murdoch, unless Trump drops the suit, then the legal process will move forward. Murdoch can certainly afford the lawyers. I mean, he's sued Murdoch personally, remember, as well as the Wall Street Journal. And then we, please God, we'll move on to depositions and all the rest of it. So I'll be very interested. I mean, Trump's tactic is just to wait for Murdoch to die, but Murdoch's mother lived to be 101. He's only 94, so this one could last. So just think about it. Rupert Murdoch will be the one that saves us from Donald Trump. A pretty ironic thought.
Imagine,
but hey, we can only wish.
One last question for you. Why do you think the Democrats seem to be so powerless to stop or to block some of these Trump initiatives, many of which are either illegal or so egregious that they ought to be easy to block? Why are the Democrats just not able to act?
Because the Democrats, they're a hollowed out party. They don't. The prime imperative of the Democratic Party is the Democratic establishment is to maintain control of the party. So for them, they're thinking, I know this is what they're thinking. They're thinking, hey, we'll sit around, he'll go, we'll win the midterms. We're going to win the Virginia gubernatorial election. They talk a lot about that. Abigail Spanberger, who's, we use the word centrist. I think, why can't we just say it out loud? Right wing, conservative.
Yes, that's right.
Spanberger will win the governor's race in Virginia, and that'll be a huge victory, and then that'll play into the midterms, and Trump will have tanked the economy by then, so we can really capitalize by that, and everything will be hunky dory. In the meantime, more importantly, we'll have beaten back this pesky uprising, from the base. Who elected them?
That's right.
Someone, a friend of mine, a black progressive activist in Philadelphia, Salim Holbrook, he put it to me this way a little while ago. He said, the Democratic Party has been fighting a counterinsurgency campaign for the last 10 years. Counterinsurgency, that's what they can do. Beat down the left, that's what they do. And
that's it.
Now they've got the Russian army, i.e. Trump, coming at them, and they don't know what to do about it. But I don't think they're upset, and individual, members, they speak up, but they can't, not just now, we've had just over half the Democratic senators vote to cut off arms to Israel. Well, alhamdulillah for that.
Finally.
But just under half voted to continue, which is pretty disgraceful. Steny Hoyer just led a whole team of Democratic congressmen to Israel. Why can't they resist Trump? I think, well, they'd like to. I mean, they keep saying, well, we don't control the Congress, so what can we do? But there's no real spirit of resistance, no sort of mobilization, no calls for, on the labor movement to rally. It's all just like want to operate inside the system. Schumer does his little maneuvers to hold up bills. Cory Booker went without a piss for 25 hours. Hooray! It's kind of pathetic, and people see it as pathetic. It's as you see in the poll. The Democratic party is disappearing. I mean, whatever it is, the last poll, the polling is at subterranean levels. You have, in the States, you have, individual, at the bottom, people are mobilized, but they're certainly not being led from the top for the reasons, I think some of which I've listed.
Well, Andrew Cockburn, thank you so much for joining us. Andrew is a journalist, and he's the Washington, D.C. editor of Harper's Magazine, which I never missed an issue of. Continue to never miss an issue. His books and his articles are principally about national security, and he has produced many award-winning documentary films. Check out his work on his Substack at spoilsofwar.substack.com. And ladies and gentlemen, please hit the like, the share, and subscribe button. It helps us so much to be able to continue these conversations. Andrew, thanks again for joining us. Such a great pleasure to see you.
A lot of fun. Thank you, John.
Thank you.